Good afternoon and welcome to this month's show. I'm Luke McCormack. During today's show, we will discuss critical issues facing government and industry leaders in cybersecurity strategies. With me on today's show are Wanda Jones-Heath, Chief Information Security Officer for the U.S. Air Force; Alma, Chief Information Security Officer, Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection; Tony Hubbard, Principal, Government Cybersecurity, KPMG; Venice Goodwine, Chief Information Security Officer with USDA; Jim Richberg, Field CISO, Fortinet; Greg Crabb, Chief Information Security Officer, United States Postal Service; and MK Palmore, Vice President Field Chief Security Officer, Palo Alto Networks. Well, if you think about, we've talked about on this show healthcare IT, we've talked about cloud computing, we've talked about mobile, we've talked about next-gen networks, we've talked about AI and ML, robotics process automation. All of these capabilities layered with the executive orders, the President's management agenda, cloud smart policy that came out, the Technology Modernization Fund. You bring all those things together and they're really focusing on transforming these agencies and enabling the mission. And I'll admit, for a long time, the perception was always, oh, the cybersecurity guys, they're just going to say no. And now that community is really saying yes, right? We're going to enable the mission, and here's how we're going to do it. And we're going to make sure that we do it properly, because we know if we don't, there's unintended consequences, right? Wanda, let's start with you. And we always like to start off and just talk about, sort of the program state of the state. Give me a couple of examples, if you will, of areas where you guys are making progress in the Air Force. Big subject, you've got embedded systems, et cetera. What's happening over at the Air Force with cybersecurity?
So Luke, great to be here. Some exciting things are going on in the Air Force. Some of the things that we're working on, of course, is risk management. Cybersecurity, as you mentioned, has always been, the folks who say no. So now we are trying to make sure that cybersecurity is in the forefront. One of the things that I've been working on for the last 8 months is our risk management approach. We're starting to look at it from a different lens, looking at it from what can we do now knowing the vulnerabilities and the threats that we face. One of the things that I'm looking at is we have 3 keys as we move out on understanding how do we get to an answer of yes. One being, let's start with our cyber hygiene. That is 80% of the solution. If we start looking at the basics of things that we should have done in the beginning, but now we're trying to go back and do now, we can catch up on some of the things that we missed along the development cycle. The next one is looking at what can we do to continuously monitor the systems that we are now hardened and fixed. Industry standards, going through industry practices, using pen testing. We've employed that throughout some of our systems, and we have been amazed. As you know, in the news, we recently did it on Cloud One. That was one of the things that I fought for because I knew that we had some work to do. And so by doing pen testing, using bug bounty approach, we're able to find the things we just could not find through mere paperwork. So that was one of the things that we're focusing on. And lastly is our Kessel Run. That's been in the news as well, where we're talking about how do we certify a software factory so that the development process includes cybersecurity approaches throughout testing, going back and looking at the code, things like that. So we're making a lot of good strides in the Air Force. So we're keep moving and pressing ahead. And
there's always that delicate balance of risk and sort of going back and trying to plug the holes of some aging technology versus embedding the security into the new environment. Alma, tell us about what's happening over at DHS at CBP, and there's a lot of moving parts there, a lot of activity as you guys modernize those environments and enable your workforce.
Yeah, there absolutely has been, and picking up on what you had said as well. So we're doing all the same things as far as cyber hygiene is always going to be the most critical thing that you have to pay attention to every day. So you have most of the attacks that are actually happening against known vulnerabilities. So as long as you're going back and you're patching those, that's a lot of the issue. But when you look at the overall framework for how you do cybersecurity. So you have to identify all your assets. You have to know what's on your network. You have to actually harden, protect, and patch and control those assets in a protective way. But then beyond that, you actually have to make sure you have a proper operation to be able to detect when there's an issue, respond to that, and recover from those. So we've been trying to do a better job of going back and ensuring that we have complete coverage across that entire spectrum and life cycle, where we're paying the right amount of attention to the hardening and the response, but also that we know that we can find a bad guy if their bad guy does happen to get into the network, and that we can really have alerting based on that. So we've also gone back and we're doing a lot more penetration testing. We were the first component within DHS to be able to implement a bug bounty program. So that's a new program for us, and that's been going very, very well, because we can never have enough penetration testers within our organization. And then strategically, we've built out for the security operation a chief security architect function. And the job of that chief security architect is to ensure that as we have the cloud infrastructures are coming up, as we have all of the IoT type devices that are coming on the network, as we look to really modernize the way that is we provide our IT out to the field, that we have security built in like from the get-go, and that's embedded rather than having to come around behind and try to bolt security on afterwards. A big area for that within the cloud has been with the security DevOps, the SecDevOps pipeline, having security done to the code as it's going through the pipeline, so that we know security is built in versus having to come around after it's already deployed and then do our security scanning and then decide whether or not it's something that should be allowed in production, or for that matter, just perhaps missing things that would go into production and just put the whole agency at risk.
It really is the name of the game, is to getting in front of that life cycle, if you will, and incorporating it right into the build. It's really makes for a real efficient way of operating. Tony, you've been working in the risk management world for a long time, so tell us about what's happening at KPMG. Give us maybe a couple of examples of what you're seeing out there these days.
Yeah, well, I certainly would like to echo what Wanda and Alma were saying around the concept of hygiene. I think there's still a lingering perception that cyber is this highly technical realm, and there's certainly elements to that, but when you look at some of the most significant breaches and vulnerabilities, in many cases it's a low-hanging fruit, or it's the weakest link in the chain. And so I think, as Alma was saying, just making sure that you've got good hygiene in place, patching your systems, sometimes the less exciting elements, the training and awareness, just making sure that your community is aware of the risks out there. So I think that you can't emphasize that point enough. And then where we're seeing a lot of progress in the broader area with a lot of the agencies is just around that concept of risk management that Wanda was talking about. I think there's more recognition now that the concept of preventing all of all breaches is that concept has kind of left the station. Now it's more about, okay, the assumption is we're going to have a breach or we've already been breached. So now how do we make sure that we're isolating our most important assets? We're segmenting our environment such that our crown jewels are protected, understanding that we might need to sacrifice some other assets, but we just can't protect everything in the same way. And I think that transition to more of that true risk management framework idea, I think we're seeing a lot of progress with a lot of agencies.
Sure, and that sort of multi-layered concept, and just being aware very quickly that you have a problem, right? And knowing that you have it, and then being able to deal with it and address it. That resiliency is really important. Venice, how about at USDA? I don't think anyone, or at least a lot of people, don't seem to realize the vastness of USDA worldwide. You've got Foreign Service officers all over the globe, and the footprint that you have across this country is just incredible. And I certainly have a soft spot for the farmers and the like. So tell us about all the activity that's going on at USDA.
So thank you, Luke. So one of the things, USDA being a lighthouse organization because of the work that we're doing with the Centers of Excellence. So in part of that, in modernizing our security posture, we've taken on the initiative to establish, to complete a security operation consolidation. And what that's going to entail is, as you mentioned, all of our missionaries are everywhere, and some of them are doing SOC functions or SOC-like functions on their own. So the purpose of this initiative is to bring all of those activities under one roof and have one enterprise SOC, and then we will provide that as a service to the mission areas.
Okay.
And that in of itself is a big task, but that enterprise view then, but it allows us to know, as my colleagues, staff, talked about, what's on my network, who's on my network, what's happening on my network. And that view gives me an opportunity to be more proactive as opposed to reactive, which is what we've done in the past. So we've taken this process and to look at, first of all, what is a SOC and exactly what should it be doing in accordance with the cybersecurity framework published by NIST, but also the people portion of that SOC. And so using the NICE framework to identify the right skills in the SOC that will help us to do the things like identify anomalies and detection, or in order to be proactive in that way. And then also, when you talk about the SOC, what about the processes within the SOC? It's not just incident response. We want to have the ability and the capabilities to also to do threat hunting within our network as well. Some of my colleagues talked about pen testing, and having that inherent capability is also key within a SOC, because that also allows us, again, to be proactive with finding our vulnerabilities. So as you see, and then also the tools portion, I cannot forget the tools piece of that, because
All the
sometimes,
tools. And there's a lot of them.
And so what we've started to do is not to chase the shiny toy, but really to focus on capabilities. And then having this enterprise SOC will help us to sunset some of those tools that provide the same capability. So this effort in and of itself, I think, will be a cost saver for the department as a whole.
Yeah, oddly enough, I had a long conversation yesterday with a bunch of cyber experts, all state of Mez, and we were talking about zero trust, and you just sort of get an appreciation of all the tools and all the journey that you've gone on, that we've all gone on over the last 10 years. Speaking of tools and technology and capabilities, Jim, tell us what's happening at Fortinet. You all sit in a very unique position there where you're seeing a lot of different things. Tell us about some activities that are going on across the community.
Well, thank you, Luke. Well, as you noted, we really are positioned as the creators of the solutions, the products and services that enable the types of solutions that my colleagues have talked about implementing. And I'd like to highlight two briefly. One is what we're doing in terms of a unified platform approach. We often talk about the attack or vulnerability surfaces growing exponentially. That makes our job in cybersecurity that much harder. But the reality is industry is increasingly moving in the direction of saying you can have devices, virtual or physical, that can be at the edge in the case of a classic wired network or software-defined network, at the access points that'll capture Wi-Fi and IoT, the network core, and then you replicate those same capabilities inside the cloud. So if you look at that, you say, what I've done is I have instrumented that growing surface that things can come at me from, and those instrumented devices also have the ability to take action. They are control devices as well. So if you can somehow manage to put the data coming from all those places together in real time, which gets into my second issue, AI, you have the ability to actually take action. Again, I just joined Fortinet 5 months ago after 34 years in federal service, and in part of that time,
your service.
Thank you. I was the one who worked on Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, the CNCI, and the holy grail for CNCI was we were trying to build a common operating picture of threats to federal networks, shared situational awareness of what was happening, and the ability to respond at machine speed. And if you build out this vision of unified technology platforms and their ecosystems, the products don't all have to come from one vendor, but the data is interoperable and pooled, and you say, and I have the ability to have policy-driven automated action, I've actually reached that holy grail that we strove for in the last 15 years of my federal career.
Wow, it's fascinating. The AI piece of this, embedding that into enabling a lot of the security capabilities is a real game changer. Greg, I don't know if anyone can even imagine the scale that you operate at the United States Postal Service, and I think every citizen certainly has a relationship with the mail service in one form or another, and I would say it's top notch, by the way. I love my mail service. But tell us about sort of what's going on there and the sort of the things that the CISO needs to wrap their head around in dealing at that level of complexity.
Thank you very much, Luke, and thank you for your being a great customer of the Postal Service. And I believe thank our listeners for interacting with the Postal Service on a day in and day out basis. At the Postal Service, we've been trying to drive a culture of cybersecurity. It takes over 600,000 professionals to deliver the mail for you every day. And at the Postal Service, it's important for us to not only understand the cyber threats that each of our employees faces, but they have to deal with a lot of technology in order to deliver our customers' experience. And so training and awareness is an extremely important program for us. We've got an award-winning program called CyberSafe at USPS, and through that program we provide training to all of our employees, and we provide awareness messaging for not only our employees but our customers and our business partners as well. We also run a very robust counter-phishing program. Our employees are our first line of defense to cyber threats, and it's important for us to understand the types of lures that they're susceptible to and how we can go about creating behavioral change among our employees so that they don't fall for those types of schemes. So delivering on that cyber-aware culture is extremely important as we look to the future for the Postal Service.
Every employee has to be a cyber warrior, right? I mean, it's just, it has to be, right? And it's really, really important. And statistics show over and over that that's the first line of defense a lot of times and the first vulnerability. MK, Palo Alto is right smack in the middle of this ecosystem. They're right meshed into this fabric. Tell us a little bit about what's going on and sort of from a Palo Alto perspective.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Luke, first of all, thanks for having Palo Alto be a participant in this very esteemed panel. I as well have just completed a 32-year career of service with the federal government, and my last stint, or the last 22 years as a FBI agent. And so to my colleagues on the panel who continue the fight in terms of the posturing for their security apparatus within the federal government, I understand your pain, and I think that I applaud you for continuing the efforts that you are engaged in terms of fortifying your networks and trying to keep your employees and everyone safe. So Palo Alto Networks is in a unique position now to understand where we need to be headed in the future. We kind of keep focused on three things: securing the enterprise, securing the cloud, and securing the future. If we dig a little deeper into those three concepts, we're talking about securing the enterprise. And so for my colleagues on the panel, their enterprises today continue to grow, really explode. Most enterprises are global nowadays, and so there's still a need, as one of the panelists said, to pay attention to the fundamentals. You know, your connectivity to your networks now is extended tremendously. You have folks, even in government service, using mobile devices, all manner of connectivity to the networks, and so there's a need to pay attention to those fundamentals in terms of securing the interaction that your employees have within those networks. Securing the cloud. You know, most of these agencies are in a period of transition, moving to a cloud architecture or a cloud structure in some way, shape, or form. And so at Palo Alto Networks, we understand that there are unique security issues associated with cloud transformations, and we intend to be the cybersecurity partner of choice in helping these organizations transition to the cloud. And securing the future for us, one of my colleagues here mentioned the need for automation. We understand that, you know, in an environment nowadays, especially for instance a SOC environment, analysts are looking at thousands of alerts during the course of a day. And so automation needs to play a part in bringing those alerts down to something definable that a small contingent of folks can take a look at and really begin to dig deeply into the most important alerts that they encounter during the course of a day.
There's not enough professionals to do it from manually. You have to automate these capabilities to do it properly. That's a given. Well, we're going to take a short break and we'll be right back. You're listening to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. With me on today's show are Wanda Jones-Heath with U.S. Air Force, Alma Cole with Customs and Border Protection, Tony Hubbard with KPMG, Venus Goodwine with USDA, Jim Richberg with Fortinet, Greg Crabb at United States Postal Service, and MK Palmore with Palo Alto Networks. Well, we're talking about cybersecurity. I wanted to get into a question about priorities for next year. We'll talk about the future towards the end of the show, but let's just talk about, what does a roadmap look like for next year? Venus, let's start with you in regards to USDA.
Okay.
What are your priorities for next year?
Yeah, I have 3 priorities. I need to inculcate a culture of cybersecurity at USDA.
Wow. How many employees at USDA?
Over 100,000.
Wow.
And the reason that's important is because, as you mentioned, every individual is a sensor for me that will let me know exactly what's happening in the cyber ecosystem.
Or an attack vector.
Absolutely,
right?
For sure, right?
Yeah.
But also just making sure that cybersecurity is baked in and not bolted on. We say that all the time, but we need to continue to beat that drum because it is definitely cheaper to do it up front than to try to do it on the end. My other priority is going to be, we talked about automation. USDA has taken on robotics process automation, RPA. So we want to use that in our risk management program to see how we can then automate some of our compliance activities so that we can use that staff, because as we know, cybersecurity professionals, there is a shortage, high demand, low supply. And then also the last thing is really, we talked about earlier, I heard on the panel that you can't protect everything. So really protecting my crown jewels. If I had one cyber dollar, where would I spend it?
Yep.
And so managing that program and elevating that program, and then making sure that my the leadership can make risk-based decisions. So
Right,
those are
I mean,
the things I'm focused on.
Sure, that risk-based management is really important, including about where you put your investments, right?
Absolutely.
It's really critical. MK, how about at Palo Alto? What's on the docket for next year in regards to priorities?
Yeah, fantastic question. So to sort of elaborate on a portion of my last answer, really the transition to the cloud, I think, is where our interests lay in the coming year. Certainly, as we mentioned, many organizations are at various aspects in terms of their transition to the cloud. What we try and do is help them understand that in cloud architecture, there are still security concerns, either in public, private, or hybrid models in terms of the cloud. And so in executing that transition, many, I think, lapse or forget the idea that although there's a shared responsibility model as it relates to security, there are still security issues that the folks who own the data need to understand and make sure that they implement along the way. The second thing I would key in on after cloud transformations or cloud architecture certainly would be that automation piece. Palo Alto Networks has made some acquisitions within the past year, I think, that lend ourselves and really dive deeply into the automation aspect of, again, a portion of the answer that I gave during the last segment. And that's this idea that, again, the attackers are certainly using automation in terms of how it is that they're coming at our networks. And so the expectation that you're going to have people on the other side battling what is really an automated attack, you're setting yourself up really to lose in that gamble. And so at Palo Alto Networks, we understand that. We feel that, again, if you implement automation in the right way, that you can, again, drill down into the most necessary and focused alerts so that you can spend time really on the things that are impacting your network.
Yeah, really sort of scrape back and find the needle in the stack of needles kind of thing, right? Alma, how about at Customs and Border Protection? What are your priorities? You got a lot of moving parts going on over there these days. What's the priorities for next year?
Yeah, so we're really looking hard at what we have with our data, what data we have right now, and actually how we better utilize that data. And we're trying to get away from some of the tool-centric approaches to be a much more neutral approach that uses more APIs that actually again, focus is on starting to automate what we have, and then starting to better share information machine to machine at machine speed across the department. So we've talked a lot about Security Operations Center, and we now have a standard for how we actually go out and assess Security Operations Centers within DHS. We think that's a really, really important thing for us to make sure we're at the right level, and if we're not, that we can go seeking services. But part of that discussion has been around, well, how much tool consolidation do we need to be doing? And what we found is that right now we actually can set up an architecture so that we can actually share data from tools in a neutral way that is not dependent on having this tool or that tool, but actually can essentially be a neutral conduit for being able to not only provide that data, then also to be able to automate actions based on whatever the results are that we're seeing. So the outcome then is that at the department level, they can have a dashboard, they can see everything that's happening at the component level that meet their requirements, so they can know what's happening with either vulnerabilities or with cyber threats. And at the component level, we can have visibility to what's happening at the department. And then as things are happening either at the component or the department, then we can automate those responses from back and forth from one to the other to assure that not only we can respond quickly, but also that we're really making effective use of the resources that we have within DHS.
Sure, and sort of a federated approach. Different ways to go about the same sort of problem set, if you will, same sort of challenge, same sort of priority, if you will. Jim, how about at Fortinet? Tell us about what's on the docket as far as priorities for Fortinet.
So thanks, Luke. I'd like to key on three in particular. The first would be OT, or operational technology. The second would be AI, machine learning. And the third would be services. And looking at the vision I laid out for what a unified platform ecosystem approach can do for you, I think we all, as CIOs and CISOs, gravitated to IT, but that's also equally applicable to OT. Now, we may have, with the exception of my colleague, fewer actual plant floors where we do operational things, but there is some of it in government, and certainly that's a big priority in the private sector. And even at the edge, that's one where AI becomes very important, because you may have an OT environment that is less connected to the internet, therefore that places more of a premium on the ability to have local autonomy in terms of being able to defend it. AI is, again, integral to being able to do the kind of automation at scale that we described. And we're not newcomers to AI. We've been using it in a production environment since 2011. The bulk of the signatures of malicious activity we actually generate are done totally by machine. We're on our 6th generation of deployed technology, but like fine wine, it takes time to cultivate and curate AI, and there's always room for another turn of the crank. And the third issue of services, that entire approach of a unified ecosystem I described may sound very hardware-centric, but it actually has a service dimension to it as well, because the same kind of instrumentation that you have out there allows you to do things like real-time asset inventory. We all deal with the issue of shadow IT, and how can you defend something on your network that you don't even know you have? But the same kinds of presence and instrumentation can in real time keep an inventory of devices, of accounts, and of software and platforms.
Sure,
so
that age-old issue of what is on my network. And speaking of OT, I know there's a lot of OT over at the Postal Service. Greg, why don't you tell us about some priorities for the next year at the Postal Service?
Absolutely. The three priorities that I'm looking at for next fiscal year are privileged access management, identity lifecycle management, and secure coding practices. And my leadership team and I have been doing a lot of benchmarking with not only other government agencies, but academia and private industry as well. And identity is becoming the new perimeter. And so the investments that we're making in our identity lifecycle management practice, I think, are going to set us up to be able to make strong transitions to the cloud and be able to interact with these different technologies in a more secure way. And so the alignment that we're making around the recent OMB guidance on identity credential and access management that was issued in May really has set us a path to be able to reach that future of a strong identity perimeter.
Yeah, you know, again, back to that zero trust conversation, and boy, you really realize that identity and identity management is the name of the game, right? I mean, that's the play as you look at sort of these new techniques of securing the environment. Wanda, how about the Air Force? What does the priorities for next year look like?
So we have a lot of different priorities, but as the Air Force is under a transformational state as we move towards our digital roadmap. Cybersecurity is definitely a key point and interest as we try to understand where we are and where we're going. Some of the things that I'm going to continue to work, of course, is risk management. One of the colleagues already talked about, you know, the OT community, the PIT community, as well as our traditional IT. So for me, cybersecurity means that I must protect in every environment, but it does require a different approach. Also, looking at automation, I am in tool overload. But how do we take advantage?
Tool overload.
Yes. How do we take advantage of the tools we have and then share those across the different platforms and systems in our entire ecosystem? And lastly, of course, the people. We have some great people, great skills. We just need to make sure that we're using them in the right places where we can have an advantage over the adversary.
Sure. Really important to be able to do that, enable every capability that the workforce has available to them, and to maximize, to fight the good fight, right? Tony, how about at KPMG? Tell us about some priorities for next year.
Well, certainly, I think staying on the theme of a lot of my colleagues, and I'll say, I think it really gets back again to focusing on that mission resilience concept and having an inventory of your devices, knowing your environment, knowing your network. And that really feeds into one of the topics we haven't talked a lot about yet, is around your supply chain and your third-party providers. Because you look at a lot of the breaches that have occurred, many times it's been around your third-party ecosystem.
Collateral systems, right?
Yeah,
Those tertiary systems. Yep.
And what we're finding is many times, I think there's still a perception that if we're outsourcing this capability or that capability, or we're relying on a third party, that we just kind of wash our hands and say that's their job. And obviously, it's our data as an agency, and so we got to make sure that we have a good solid inventory of those third-party providers, a good vendor risk management program, so that we're kind of monitoring the controls around that. So I think that's the critical part of that mission resilience concept. And then just to stay on the theme of automation, as you said, Luke, there's just no way we're going to be able to throw enough cybersecurity professionals at these challenges. So automation around some of the more mundane tasks, audit trail reviews, access management, account provisioning, so that our best and brightest cybersecurity professionals could focus on these more challenging tasks, is going to be absolutely critical as we go forward.
It's just not enough manpower realistically to think you're going to be able to properly secure that environment. And these collateral tertiary systems that you talked about, it's not only the vendor, if you will, protecting that data at rest and in that environment, it's the vulnerability of getting into that environment and then making its way into your environment, which is where a lot of these, larger breaches begun. You're right, in that sort of a configuration like that. Well, let's talk about lessons learned. And as we adopt a lot of these capabilities, there's always, as I talked at the beginning of the show, unintended consequences, right? And there's lessons learned positive, and there's lessons learned that are not positive, we'll say. Venice, let's start with you in regards to USDA and some lessons learned.
Thank you, Luke. I think the biggest lesson learned that I would like to share is technology modernization is great, but don't forget to modernize your people and their skills. When we embarked upon doing process automation using RPAs, we started in our chief financial office and we automated some disbursements and saved about $75,000 a year and project to save $2.2 million. But also we saved hours, 2 to 3 hours. per day on individuals. But now the question is, what now do you have those people do? So when we talk about the automation or we talk about the migration to the cloud, let's not forget that we need to modernize probably the skills of the individuals who are doing that work today. And so one of the things we're doing at USDA is we're participating in the Federal CIO Council established, or Interagency Career Pathways Group. And that group is tasked with taking the 43 of the cybersecurity NICE codes from the framework and actually creating a roadmap, a career roadmap. And so what that does for me at USDA is helps me to build a workforce strategy so that I can make sure that the cybersecurity professionals there have the latest, the greatest, and the relevant cybersecurity skills that we need at USDA.
Enabling that workforce, job one, right? I mean, it's just an absolute must. Jim, let's throw it over to Fortinet. Tell us about a situation there where lessons learned, maybe a positive or a negative.
So I'll actually make it very personal. So these are not about Fortinet, the company. I've actually had time to do a lot of reflection about things I've learned about cyber since joining the private sector. I wish I'd known when I was still a senior executive in federal service. And I'll give you three broad ones. In government, we tend not to understand the full extent to which digital transformation has taken off in the private sector. I mean, we may be moving into the cloud in government, we may be doing X as a service, but if you talk to private sector organizations, they are largely wholly dependent on the internet and online capability to be able to function at all. So that was one lesson learned, that the private sector is far, far ahead of government in embracing that digital transformation. With it comes risk that they don't always know about, but they recognize that they're heading into uncharted waters. The second is, and I'm coming from the perspective of someone who used to run the National Counterintelligence Program for the federal government, the issue of insider. Now, we all talk about insider threat. I don't actually like that term compared to insider risk, because yes, while there are bad apples in every barrel, the fact is the majority of people are hardworking, dedicated to the organization, but in total, there's probably more damage that happens from people accidentally doing harm than intentionally. It's insider risk. If you look at, for instance, in that digital transformation, web applications, their misconfigured web applications used by employees cause a lot of vulnerability that gets exploited. People sending emails, they reply to all instead of just to their boss, and therefore they inadvertently send information outside the organization. There are ways of harnessing technology so that you can help people who are trying to do the right thing to do it. And then the third is the underappreciated extent to which software-defined networking has been taking off in the private sector. Yeah, government gets the cloud. Yes, we get using, fill in the blank as a service. But the fact that you can talk to large private sector organizations where, other than corporate headquarters, all of their branch doesn't even have a physical network and a server. Everything is software-defined. So those are three epiphanies, three lessons learned that I've had in my transition from federal service to the private sector.
Good stuff. Alma, give me one lesson learned from CBP, positive or negative.
So IT security can't do it alone. You have to really have excellence in IT operations if you want to have a successful and secure enterprise. We can report all day on vulnerabilities that are discovered, but we can't overcome bad IT management practices. So we have to assure, one, that we're not only putting Band-Aids on things, but we're going back and that we're, as an enterprise, addressing systematic legacy issues and old bad practices and old stovepipes of information or identities, and that we're overcoming some of those legacy challenges and actually building a proper platform to move forward on. And also that we can take, when there are vulnerabilities, when there are other issues, and we have that visibility from a security perspective, that we can assure that we have both the right accountability on who's responsible for addressing those issues, and then the right governance in place to be able to work with our CIO and with other leadership to shine a light in those areas that need to be shined a light on. So as an enterprise, we can focus on those highest risks to the enterprise and then shift those IT resources to addressing those as an organization.
Looking back while looking forward, Well, we're going to take another short break. You're listening to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. We're talking about cybersecurity strategies, and with me on today's show are Wanda Jones-Heath, U.S. Air Force, Alma with Customs and Border Protection, Tony Hubbard with KPMG, Venus Goodwine with USDA, Jim Richberg with Fortinet, Greg Crabb with United States Postal Service, and M.K. Palmore with Palo Alto Networks. We were talking about lessons learned, positives and negatives. And MK, let's start with you. Give us some lessons learned about sort of what you guys are seeing out there in the Palo Alto sort of ecosystem that you'd like to share with the audience.
Yeah, so Luke, lessons learned. The issue that was brought up earlier in an earlier segment about sticking to the fundamentals, sort of basic internet hygiene. Here's what we know. Adversaries are experts at what I call return on investment, right? They identify the easiest way in order to engage and basically execute their fraud. In doing that, they're looking for the easiest solution possible for them, the easiest way in. This is why we know that things like misconfiguration, email attachments, in terms of social engineering and phishing, still work for them. And so I think the big lesson learned is that paying attention to the fundamentals still makes sense. And so you need to spend time on that in your environments, making sure that you shore up those fundamentals in addition to looking ahead to the future and trying to make a determination from a strategic standpoint in terms of how you're going to make long-term investments in cybersecurity. But if you're not doing the fundamentals, you still have gaps in your environment.
Sure. Got to block and tackle, right? It's table stakes. Wanda, how about at Air Force? Can you give us some lessons learned that you're seeing as you're embracing on this journey that you're on?
Yes, my colleagues already mentioned most of the ones that I would definitely echo. Starting with cybersecurity is everyone's business, from the top of the chain of leadership all the way to the flight line. I, as a CISO and my team, can't do it all. I have to build partnerships. My colleague here, Alma, talked about how do we partner with those who've already done this, or partner with the folks who we need to meet where they are. Every system has different cybersecurity challenges, and we have to assess and be able to determine what's the best way to protect those systems. And lastly, leadership. As a senior leader in the Air Force, I also need my top cover at the Pentagon. I've not had any trouble with getting support throughout the enterprise. We have it from the SecAv to the undersecretary. So everyone understands at the top that cybersecurity is part of what we need to address as we fly, fight, and win.
Sure, and to use an Air Force metaphor, you need that air cover, right? Okay. To make these things happen. Makes a lot of sense. Greg, how about at UPS? UPS.
At the Postal Service.
Sorry about that, Postal Service employees. Tell us about some lessons learned there.
Absolutely. Executive engagement and buy-in has been critical for the blossoming of my information security practice. We recently established an executive cyber risk committee that is comprised of not only the CIO, but General Counsel, CFO, the Chief Human Resources Officer. Yeah. And we have very robust conversations about the cyber risks that their organization faces and the controls that we have to invest in order to be able to keep those resources protected. And so that engagement has allowed us to make the types of investments that are necessary in order to be able to properly secure the Postal Service.
Yeah, I call that sort of C-suite goal congruence, right? When you get that community together and laser focused on that end game, all of a sudden, things start to happen and go in the right direction. Well, we only have a few minutes left, so we're gonna talk about painting a picture of the future and just sort of bring us over the horizon a little bit, not into the petri dish, but over the horizon. We're going to start with you, MK. Tell us about, what does it look like out there in 2 or 3 years? What can we expect from sort of Palo Alto serving this community? Paint us a picture there.
Yeah, so I'll go back to two of my previous points, which are an emphasis on cloud security, which I think will just become increasingly of importance to many enterprises and organizations, certainly those within the government. And so assisting our customers and others with that transition to the cloud will remain of importance to us. And then secondly, the idea surrounding automation. To the extent that you can both automate within your security environment to lessen the impact on the workforce and automate in terms of sharing of threat intelligence among both customers and others that you frequently share intelligence with. The sharing of intelligence, I think, oftentimes doesn't get enough attention. It really, no one has complete oversight or insight into the cyber threat landscape, but together we all have a pretty decent picture. And so the more that we collaborate and share amongst one another, the more informed I think we all are in terms of providing those defensive mechanisms in our environment.
Right. When we fuse together, it's that greater good, particularly in those community of interest. I get boxes put on my porch on Sunday these days. I get an email in my mailbox that tells me exactly what's coming in the mail. Well, what can we look for in 2 to 3 years from the United States Postal Service?
Well, I'm very optimistic about the future from a cybersecurity perspective. However, organizations have to be proactive, and we're taking proactive steps to protect the future of that relationship that we provide to our customers. The technologies that we're looking at, autonomous technologies, I think will have a big impact, and the role of the CISO is going to have to grow into one of safety. And we also have to look at where the IoT devices and the interaction and the amount of information and data that's going to be exchanged, where 5G is taking us from an amount of information that's going to be transmitted over the wire. All of those things provide a lot of challenges that we're going to have to face, but as long as we are vigilant and evolve with those technologies, we'll be able to meet the future.
Wow. We're just talking about 5G. That's going to really be a huge enabler for the Postal Service, I'm sure, and everyone else. Jim, how about at Fortinet? What does it look like when we look over the horizon a little bit?
So over the horizon is probably farther than 2 to 3 years. And I am not a technology fanboy. Cybersecurity is a combination of people, process or policy, and technology. But I think the combination of this platform approach to actually being able to look across my whole surface, coupled with the automation that AI gives us, potentially is a tipping point in cybersecurity. We've always had this truism that we say cybersecurity is hard because the attacker only has to get lucky once, the defense has to be perfect every time. Where the reality is, and I say this as someone who worked the offensive mission, the attacker never sits down, writes something, and has it work the first time. You try again. What we've allowed them to do is either be undetected, which often means we saw it was in the audit logs, but we didn't actually look for it in real time and do anything with it, or we didn't respond to it. If you take that away and say, I see them trying and failing, I can actually immunize everybody against it before they even succeed, that's a game changer. You've mentioned zero trust a couple of times, Luke, and the same kind of instrumentation and automation driven by AI gives you that visibility and control that actually allows you to move in the direction of zero trust as well. So I think you put those together, AI plus the ability to instrument things, I think we may actually be able to say we finally are tipping the balance from what are really relatively small malicious actor sets coming against what are relatively large, well-resourced organizations, tip it back in our favor.
Right. The moment they sort of start to jiggle that doorknob, you instantly want to be able to react to that and let everyone know that and immunize. I like the way you said that. Venus, how about at USDA? Tell us, what does it look like as you look out there a little bit? What are you guys cooking up there in the...
Oh, good. So for USDA, you've already mentioned we are all over the place, continental United States and internationally. So what you're going to see from my seat is really that we integrate security requirements into our mobile technology. When users are off the network but still have government furnished equipment, I want to know what they're doing outside the network. So integrating those requirements is going to be important. And then modernization, we will continue to modernizing our people, using every opportunity to reskill or rebuild our individual cyber professionals, but also modernizing our technology, not just, I like to say, chasing a shiny toy, but making sure that there's a capability being met. And then lastly, you're going to see, we're going to continue to enhance our cybersecurity governance. You know, just like today, if I want to make changes to my home, I call the HOA. So when someone at USDA wants to build something, I want them to know they need to call me first, cybersecurity, to see, one, if it fits within my architecture, or two, if it's defendable. So that's what you see on the horizon at USDA.
Yeah, and I would imagine not only build something, but buy something, including a service, right? This gets into these collateral systems where all of a sudden, you know, I'm buying a drug screening service, you know, and is that conforming to all the standards that are going to serve your needs and make sure that your whole ecosystem stays secure? Tony, how about at KPMG? I mean, what does that future look like?
I think staying on the theme of automation, a couple of my colleagues have mentioned this transition to become more from a reactive to a proactive mindset around cybersecurity, and I think that's got to be driven by automations. And Venus mentioned a great example around robotic process automation, RPA.
Sure.
And using and building on those types of examples, but then even taking it to the next level around machine learning and implementing tools, notably around your threat intelligence and your security orchestration model, to get to the point where these decisions can be made in some cases by machines, so that you can get more proactive and put your resources more in a proactive way. One of the terms we like to use is prosilience, proactive cyber resilience, that we can kind of try to drive
pull that out
kind
of the Webster's dictionary. I think you just invented a word right there.
It's been out there for a little while, but
Okay.
we're trying to dust it off and use it a little bit more. But I think that kind of sums up, I think, where we're all trying to move towards, is just become more proactive and not be as just waiting for something to happen to us as much.
Right, and you get in front of that. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
almost a different kind of offense, not the offense that you're used to, but Jim over there in his former life, or perhaps even MK may have gotten involved in some of that, but you know, it's just sort of more of an offensive posture rather than you know, waiting for the event to happen, right? Maybe we catch them, you know, pulling in the driveway or looking at the house before they start jiggling the doorknob, so to speak, using that metaphor. Alma, how about at DHS? If I'm showing up there as the deputy CISO in 3 years and I'm walking into that environment, what am I in for these days? What will I be in for then?
Well, so the network modernization is definitely going to be a huge benefit for security as well. So as we look at not only pushing into the cloud, but then taking advantage more of a lot of these internet-based methods, of 5G being a perfect example of getting cheap, intense bandwidth out to the right place at the right time. That's great, and along with that, we're building in the right security. So that SDN type security, where you're only authorizing the right things can only talk to what it needs to talk to, and we have the right scanning, the right authorization. Really, we absolutely know what's on the network, and we have the right checks happening in an automated fashion, dynamically. So those are all really, really important things for us in the future. We also want to go beyond where we are today, where we're alerting on a lot of things for a SOC. We definitely want to be doing proactive data protection, and right now we're implementing DLP controls. We'll be hitting that really, really hard in the future, to where we're actually dynamically blocking any sort of issues instead of just alerting and then investigating later on. And then finally, third-party risk is definitely a big area for us. Sure. We've done a lot of work in third-party risk when it comes to managing our closest partners, and now we're looking at how we open up that lens, and we look at what's the next layer and how do we manage the rest of the partners that we're dealing with without necessarily having to go out and do certifications and accreditation on everybody that we touch.
Right, it's like you started with your high value assets sort of internally, and now you sort of going out into your version of a high value asset, if you will, on your external systems, and then taking that down tier after tier. It's a tricky area, right? Really important. Wanda, how about at the Air Force? What does that future look like when we look out?
Just
you know,
keeping
post F-35, right?
Keeping focus on cybersecurity, continuing our risk management approach, using bug bounty, pen testing, other industry approaches as we move towards zero trust networking, 5G, some of the other challenges. We want to make sure IoT, you know, we have a lot of things going on our network. Just staying vigilant, understanding that cybersecurity, it never stops, and that we continue to ensure that we integrate everything we do and think about cybersecurity on the front end.
Yeah, you know, it's well, of course, you got a big footprint in IoT, but you also have all those embedded environments, right, and all those aircraft, et cetera. That's got to be tricky. Well, we like to always go into the bonus round here, and I'll ask the feds first, and this one is in regards to challenges. I'll start with you, Wanda. What's your? Do you look into the future? You want to paint a picture? We heard it just a moment ago. What's the number one challenge for you guys?
I would say I have two. The defense industrial base. We focus a lot on IT in the wire. So I want to do more with our partners outside the fence. They produce, they build, they do a lot of things on behalf of the Air Force, and we need to make sure that we are lockstep with them, ensuring they understand what our cybersecurity requirements are so that I don't get the breach, I don't get the challenges from the adversary. So that's one area. And then just staying vigilant with cybersecurity.
Similar to what Alma was talking about. Alma, number one challenge.
Insider's always going to be the biggest challenge that we're going to have, because we have people that we need to let onto our network that we do trust, and we need to make sure that we're still, you know, verifying as we're doing that trust. You know, moving beyond that, obviously it's the same as you, the vast variety of things that we need to make sure we're supporting on the network as far as a IoT challenge goes, and we're keeping pace with the mission.
Keeping it all buttoned up. All right, we're going to roll down the line. USDA. Funding. Wow, put it right out there. You heard it, budget. You heard it, OMB, funding.
Well, in a different twist, though, USDA is funded different ways. We have fee-based organization, grant organization, working capital fund, and appropriated.
Number one funding, UPS. Whoops, United States Postal Service. Number one.
International cyber threats. We've got to keep our eye on the adversary and understand their capabilities and how to defend our networks.
I'd like to thank all of you today for taking the time out of your busy schedules and joining us for the program. I'd like to thank our sponsors, for without we do not have a show. I'd like to thank the good people here at Federal News Radio that make our program so successful and enjoyable. And most of all, I'd like to thank you, the listening audience out there that tune in every month. You've been listening to the Federal Executive Forum, part of the Federal News Network.